Long before the arrival of European explorers and settlers, the land now known as the United States was home to millions of indigenous people. These Native American societies were diverse, complex, and deeply rooted in their environments. From the towering totem poles of the Pacific Northwest to the massive mound cities of the Mississippi River Valley, indigenous civilizations had developed rich cultures, spiritual systems, and trading networks that spanned the continent. In the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built cliff dwellings and multi-story structures made of stone and adobe. They thrived through irrigation systems and intricate farming in an arid desert landscape. Farther east in present-day Ohio and Illinois, the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures built massive earth mounds and organized large urban settlements such as Cahokia, once the largest city in North America, north of Mexico, with a population that may have rivaled London at the time. Along the Atlantic coast, Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples lived in woodlands, growing maize, beans, and squash while hunting game and fishing in rivers and oceans. Each tribe had its own language, belief systems, and governance. While some lived as nomadic hunters, others formed powerful confederacies and alliances that governed territories and mediated conflicts. The Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee for instance, had a sophisticated political system and a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that would later influence the framers of the U.S. Constitution. This vast network of civilizations, however, was largely unknown to Europe until the late 15th century. The age of exploration, driven by a desire for trade, wealth, and expansion, brought European explorers to the shores of the New World. Christopher Columbus' voyage in 1492, although he never set foot on the land that would become the United States, triggered a wave of exploration and colonization. Spanish explorers such as Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado roamed the American South and West, searching for gold and glory, often clashing violently with native populations. In 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine in Florida, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the U.S. Meanwhile, the French began exploring and settling the Mississippi River region and the Great Lakes, establishing trading posts and alliances with indigenous nations, especially in the fur trade. The French presence was especially strong in areas that would become modern-day Canada and parts of the Midwest, such as Michigan and Illinois. The English, who would ultimately become the dominant colonial power in North America, were slower to establish permanent colonies. Early attempts, like the Roanoke colony in the 1580s, ended in mysterious failure. It wasn't until 1607 that the English succeeded in establishing Jamestown in Virginia. Backed by the Virginia Company, Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The colonists faced harsh conditions, famine, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. Only through the leadership of figures like Captain John Smith and assistance from Native Americans, Pocahontas, did the settlement survive its early years. A few years later, in 1620, the Pilgrims English Puritans, seeking religious freedom, established Plymouth Colony in what is now Massachusetts. Aided by the Wampanoag people, who taught them vital agricultural techniques, the Pilgrims survived their first brutal winter. Their 1621 harvest feast with the Wampanoag became the origin story of the American Thanksgiving, though the relationship between the settlers and indigenous peoples would later be marked by conflict and colonization. During the 17th century, more English colonies sprang up along the Atlantic coast. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by Puritans in 1630, quickly became a major population center. Colonies like Rhode Island and Connecticut offered new religious freedoms, while Maryland was founded as a haven for English Catholics. The Carolinas and Georgia were later established as proprietary colonies, often with economic motives focused on cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Meanwhile, New York began as a Dutch colony known as New Amsterdam, before being taken by the English in 1664. Each colony had its own unique structure, climate, and economy, but they shared common themes: exploitation of natural resources, reliance on labor, especially indentured servants, and later, enslaved Africans, and often violent displacement of indigenous peoples. Diseases brought by Europeans devastated native populations, with some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of indigenous Americans died from illness, war, or displacement within a century of contact. By the end of the 1600s, 13 distinct English colonies were forming along the Atlantic coast. While they remained politically tied to the British Crown, these colonies began developing their own identities, customs, and ideas. Town meetings, local governance, and religious congregations fostered a spirit of self-determination. Yet, life in the colonies was also harsh. Labor was grueling, infant mortality was high, and relations with Native Americans were often marked by war and mistrust. Despite these hardships, the seeds of a new nation were being sown. A growing population of settlers, increased economic independence, and a mix of cultures, European, Native American, and African, began shaping the identity of what would eventually become the United States of America. Long before the arrival of European explorers and settlers, the land now known as the United States was home to millions of indigenous people. These Native American societies were diverse, complex, and deeply rooted in their environments. From the towering totem poles of the Pacific Northwest to the massive mound cities of the Mississippi River Valley, indigenous civilizations had developed rich cultures, spiritual systems, and trading networks that spanned the continent. In the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built cliff dwellings and multi-story structures made of stone and adobe. They thrived through irrigation systems and intricate farming in an arid desert landscape. Farther east in present-day Ohio and Illinois, the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures built massive earth mounds and organized large urban settlements such as Cahokia, once the largest city in North America, north of Mexico, with a population that may have rivaled London at the time. Along the Atlantic coast, Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples lived in woodlands, growing maize, beans, and squash while hunting game and fishing in rivers and oceans. Each tribe had its own language, belief systems, and governance. While some lived as nomadic hunters, others formed powerful confederacies and alliances that governed territories and mediated conflicts. The Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee for instance, had a sophisticated political system and a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that would later influence the framers of the U.S. Constitution. This vast network of civilizations, however, was largely unknown to Europe until the late 15th century. The age of exploration, driven by a desire for trade, wealth, and expansion, brought European explorers to the shores of the New World. Christopher Columbus' voyage in 1492, although he never set foot on the land that would become the United States, triggered a wave of exploration and colonization. Spanish explorers such as Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado roamed the American South and West, searching for gold and glory, often clashing violently with native populations. In 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine in Florida, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the U.S. Meanwhile, the French began exploring and settling the Mississippi River region and the Great Lakes, establishing trading posts and alliances with indigenous nations, especially in the fur trade. The French presence was especially strong in areas that would become modern-day Canada and parts of the Midwest, such as Michigan and Illinois. The English, who would ultimately become the dominant colonial power in North America, were slower to establish permanent colonies. Early attempts, like the Roanoke colony in the 1580s, ended in mysterious failure. It wasn't until 1607 that the English succeeded in establishing Jamestown in Virginia. Backed by the Virginia Company, Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The colonists faced harsh conditions, famine, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. Only through the leadership of figures like Captain John Smith and assistance from Native Americans, Pocahontas, did the settlement survive its early years. A few years later, in 1620, the Pilgrims English Puritans, seeking religious freedom, established Plymouth Colony in what is now Massachusetts. Aided by the Wampanoag people, who taught them vital agricultural techniques, the Pilgrims survived their first brutal winter. Their 1621 harvest feast with the Wampanoag became the origin story of the American Thanksgiving, though the relationship between the settlers and indigenous peoples would later be marked by conflict and colonization. During the 17th century, more English colonies sprang up along the Atlantic coast. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by Puritans in 1630, quickly became a major population center. Colonies like Rhode Island and Connecticut offered new religious freedoms, while Maryland was founded as a haven for English Catholics. The Carolinas and Georgia were later established as proprietary colonies, often with economic motives focused on cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Meanwhile, New York began as a Dutch colony known as New Amsterdam, before being taken by the English in 1664. Each colony had its own unique structure, climate, and economy, but they shared common themes: exploitation of natural resources, reliance on labor, especially indentured servants, and later, enslaved Africans, and often violent displacement of indigenous peoples. Diseases brought by Europeans devastated native populations, with some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of indigenous Americans died from illness, war, or displacement within a century of contact. By the end of the 1600s, 13 distinct English colonies were forming along the Atlantic coast. While they remained politically tied to the British Crown, these colonies began developing their own identities, customs, and ideas. Town meetings, local governance, and religious congregations fostered a spirit of self-determination. Yet, life in the colonies was also harsh. Labor was grueling, infant mortality was high, and relations with Native Americans were often marked by war and mistrust. Despite these hardships, the seeds of a new nation were being sown. A growing population of settlers, increased economic independence, and a mix of cultures, European, Native American, and African, began shaping the identity of what would eventually become the United States of America. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, was more than just a bold statement of defiance against the British Crown. It was the beginning of a long and brutal struggle for national survival. With the stroke of a pen, 13 disparate colonies officially severed their ties with one of the most powerful empires in the world. But this declaration, however eloquent and idealistic, did not guarantee victory. In fact, the odds of success seemed staggeringly low. At the time of the declaration, the colonies had no navy, no standing army capable of prolonged warfare, no reliable source of arms or funding, and limited international support. They faced a well-trained British military with a professional army, a dominant navy, and global reach. Yet what the Americans lacked in resources, they often made up for in determination, leadership, and a deep sense of purpose. The war itself had already begun a year earlier with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. In June 1775, colonial militias under the makeshift Continental Army fought the British at the Battle of Bunker Hill near Boston. Although technically a British victory, the heavy losses they suffered proved that American forces would not be easily subdued. In 1775, the Continental Congress had appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, faced the daunting task of building and maintaining a unified military force from an assortment of poorly trained and under-equipped militias. His leadership would prove essential in holding the cause together, even when defeat seemed imminent. The war was fought across many fronts. In 1776, British forces under General William Howe captured New York City after defeating Washington's troops in the Battle of Long Island. The loss of New York was a major blow, forcing Washington into a long retreat across New Jersey. Morale among the Continental Army and American citizens began to falter. But on the night of December 25, 1776, Washington led a daring counterattack. Crossing the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men, he surprised and defeated a garrison of Hessian soldiers in the Battle of Trenton. A few days later, he won another victory at Princeton. These small but symbolic wins helped rejuvenate the American cause. The following year brought both hope and peril. In October 1777, American forces under General Horatio Gates won a crucial victory at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. British General John Burgoyne's plan to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies collapsed, and he surrendered his entire army. This triumph was a turning point. It convinced France to formally ally with the United States. With the signing of the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, France agreed to provide military and financial support to the American cause. French troops, supplies, and most importantly, the French Navy would soon join the fight. Spain and the Dutch Republic would also later join the war against Britain, turning what was once a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Despite international support, the war dragged on. The British shifted their focus to the southern colonies, hoping to rally loyalist support and exploit economic importance. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780, inflicting heavy losses on American forces. But the tide began to turn once again with the help of guerrilla tactics led by American commanders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Meanwhile, in the North, Washington struggled to hold his army together during the brutal winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. With inadequate food, clothing, and shelter, thousands of soldiers suffered and died. Yet it was at Valley Forge that the army began to transform. Under the training of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, the Continental Army emerged more disciplined and better prepared for conventional warfare. The final chapter of the Revolutionary War played out in Virginia. In 1781, Washington, along with French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau and supported by the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse, laid siege to the British Army at Yorktown. After several weeks of bombardment, General Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. While scattered fighting continued elsewhere, Yorktown effectively marked the end of major combat. Negotiations began soon after. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, and the new nation gained all territory east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida, and south of Canada. It was a stunning victory. A ragtag group of colonies had successfully defeated a global empire. However, winning independence was only the first step. The question now became, how would this new country govern itself? Initially, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, adopted by Congress in 1781. The Articles created a loose alliance of sovereign states with a very weak central government. Congress had no power to tax, no authority to regulate commerce, and no executive or judicial branches. Each state had one vote, regardless of population. This system was designed to prevent tyranny and protect state sovereignty, but it quickly proved dysfunctional. The government could not raise funds, enforce laws, or manage internal disputes. Conflicts arose over trade, currency, and borders. The lack of central authority led to chaos in both domestic and foreign affairs. One of the clearest signs of instability came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion, a violent uprising of farmers in western Massachusetts who were protesting economic hardship, debt, and foreclosures. The rebellion was eventually put down, but it alarmed many leaders who feared that the republic might collapse under the weight of its own weakness. In response, a convention was called in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. But the delegates who gathered in Philadelphia soon decided to do something much more radical. They would draft an entirely new constitution. The Constitutional Convention, led by figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin, worked in secrecy over several months. The resulting document, the U.S. Constitution, created a federal system with a strong national government divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It established checks and balances and shared power between the states and the federal government. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, and then sent to the states for ratification. The ratification process was deeply contested. Supporters of the Constitution, known as Federalists, argued that a stronger central government was necessary for stability and unity. Opponents, known as Anti-Federalists, feared the new government would trample individual liberties and states' rights. To address these concerns, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights, a series of amendments that would explicitly protect civil liberties. This promise helped secure the Constitution's ratification, and it officially took effect in 1789. That same year, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He took office in New York City, which at the time was the temporary capital. Washington set many precedents that shaped the future of the presidency, including the establishment of a cabinet and the tradition of serving only 2 terms. His administration faced significant challenges. The new government had to create institutions from scratch, establishing a judiciary, setting up a national bank, and creating departments to manage war, foreign affairs, and finance. Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, 2 men with sharply contrasting visions for the nation's future. Hamilton advocated for a strong central government, industrial development, and close ties with Britain. Jefferson favored agrarianism, decentralization, and support for revolutionary France. Their rivalry defined early American politics and eventually led to the formation of the first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Foreign affairs also tested the young republic. In 1793, war broke out between Britain and France. While Jeffersonians supported France, Washington declared neutrality. His farewell address in 1796 warned against permanent foreign alliances and political factionalism advice that would echo throughout American history. Washington chose not to seek a 3rd term, and in 1796, John Adams was elected the 2nd president. Adams, a Federalist, faced mounting tensions with France, which led to the undeclared quasi-war at sea. At home, the Alien and Sedition Acts designed to suppress dissent sparked outrage and accusations of tyranny. In response, Jefferson and Madison drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which introduced the idea that states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws, a principle that would resurface in future conflicts. By the election of 1800, the divisions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had deepened. The race between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson was bitter and combative, but ultimately peaceful. When Jefferson won the presidency, power passed from one political party to another without violence, a rare event in the history of nations. The Revolution of 1800, as it was later called, marked the end of the Federalist era and the beginning of Jeffersonian democracy. More importantly, it proved that the new constitutional system could survive fierce partisanship and transition power peacefully. By the dawn of the 19th century, the United States was no longer a fragile confederation of rebellious colonies. It was a functioning republic with an elected government, a written constitution, and a growing population. Yet many challenges lay ahead: westward expansion, slavery, conflict with Native Americans, and wars with foreign powers. Still, the foundations had been laid. The American experiment in democracy, forged in the fires of revolution and built on principles of liberty and self-rule, had survived its infancy. The stage was now set for a new chapter in the country's history, one of expansion, ambition, and transformation. The turn of the 19th century marked a new era for the young United States. With the peaceful transfer of power from Federalist John Adams to Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson in 1800, the nation had successfully proven that democracy could endure political rivalry without descending into tyranny or chaos. Jefferson's victory, often called the Revolution of 1800, brought a new political philosophy into the White House, one rooted in agrarian ideals, minimal government intervention, and individual liberty. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, envisioned a nation of independent farmers spread across a vast continent. His administration worked to reduce the size and cost of the federal government, cut the national debt, and scale down the military. But despite these goals, one of the most significant and bold actions of his presidency would come in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. At the time, the vast Louisiana territory was owned by France under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson, recognizing the strategic and economic importance of the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River, originally sought to purchase just that area. But Napoleon, facing war in Europe and a failed colonial campaign in Haiti, offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory, an expanse of land that doubled the size of the United States, for $15 million. Though Jefferson worried whether the Constitution allowed for such a purchase, he approved the deal. The Louisiana Purchase was a monumental moment in American history, opening up millions of acres of land for settlement and expansion. To explore this new territory, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead an expedition westward in 1804, accompanied by a small group of men and later joined by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who served as guide and interpreter. The Lewis and Clark expedition traveled from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. They mapped the land, established relations with Native American tribes, and returned in 1806 with invaluable information that would encourage further westward migration. However, expansion came with growing pains. The United States remained entangled in global politics, particularly with Britain and France, who were again at war. Both nations interfered with American trade, but British impressment of American sailors, forcing them into service in the Royal Navy, provoked particular outrage. In response, Jefferson enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, halting all American exports. Intended to pressure Britain and France, it instead devastated the U.S. economy, especially in New England, where trade was a lifeline. The embargo was a failure and was eventually repealed. Jefferson left office in 1809, succeeded by James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Under Madison's leadership, tensions with Britain escalated. British support for Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory, combined with maritime violations, pushed the United States toward war. In 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain, the War of 1812. The conflict was marked by early defeats and disorganization. British forces burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, including the White House and the Capitol. Yet key victories, such as the defense of Fort McHenry, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, and Andrew Jackson's decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, boosted American morale. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans occurred after a peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, had already been signed, officially ending the war. News of the treaty had not yet reached American shores. While the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate with no significant territorial changes, it was seen by many Americans as a second war of independence. It solidified the country's sovereignty, weakened Native resistance in the Northwest, and sparked a surge in nationalism and economic independence. With European conflicts subsiding, The post-war period, under President James Monroe, ushered in what was called the Era of Good Feelings, a time marked by national unity and political harmony. During this era, the United States focused on internal growth and consolidation. The Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823, declared that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to further European colonization and interference. This bold foreign policy statement reflected growing confidence and set a precedent for future American intervention in Latin America. Meanwhile, the country was undergoing significant transformations. The Industrial Revolution began reshaping the economy. Innovations such as the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, revolutionized Southern agriculture by making cotton production vastly more profitable and simultaneously increasing demand for enslaved labor. In the North, factories, canals, and railroads were connecting cities and boosting commerce. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, transforming New York City into a global trade hub. As industry boomed and westward migration continued, new states joined the Union. But this expansion raised a pressing issue. Would new territories allow slavery? A delicate balance between free and slave states threatened national unity. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise attempted to resolve the crisis by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the balance in the Senate. It also banned slavery north of the 3,630 line in the remaining Louisiana Territory. Despite temporary resolution, the slavery debate would continue to fester. Meanwhile, a new political era emerged with the rise of Andrew Jackson, a war hero and populist figure. Jackson lost the contentious 1824 election to John Quincy Adams, despite winning the popular vote. The election was decided in the House of Representatives, and Jackson's supporters decried it as a corrupt bargain. 4 years later, in 1828, Jackson won a resounding victory and became the 7th president. Jackson's presidency marked the rise of the common man in American politics. He expanded suffrage for white males and dismantled elite political institutions. But his administration was also defined by conflict and controversy. One of the most infamous acts was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to territories west of the Mississippi. Despite legal victories in the Supreme Court, most notably in Worcester v. Georgia, which ruled in favor of the Cherokee Jackson, refused to enforce the decision. His administration carried out a brutal policy of removal that led to the Trail of Tears, a forced march during which thousands of Native Americans died from exposure, disease, and starvation. In economic policy, Jackson waged a war against the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as an elitist institution that favored the wealthy. He vetoed the bank's recharter and withdrew federal deposits, redistributing them to state pet banks. These actions contributed to speculative lending and inflation, eventually leading to the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that plunged the country into a deep recession. Despite economic hardship, the United States continued to grow. The belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, took firm hold of the national psyche. Settlers pushed westward, establishing homesteads, towns, and trade routes. The Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, and California Trail became arteries of migration. Yet this expansion came at a heavy price displacement of Native Americans, violence, and rising tensions over slavery. In the 1840s, the U.S. turned its attention to the Southwest and Texas. Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, and many Americans, particularly Southerners, wanted it annexed into the Union. After years of political debate, Texas was admitted as a state in 1845. This action, along with disputes over borders, led to the Mexican-American War in 1846. Under President James K. Polk, the United States launched a successful military campaign. Capturing Mexico City in 1847, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ceded vast territories to the U.S., including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In just a few decades, the U.S. had stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The new territories once again reignited the debate over slavery. Would these lands permit the institution or ban it? Tensions reached new heights in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. This set of laws admitted California as a free state, allowed popular sovereignty in other territories, and enacted a harsher fugitive slave law requiring citizens to assist in the capture of escaped slaves, even in free states. This law enraged many Northerners, who began organizing abolitionist movements with renewed energy. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman rose to prominence. Tubman, a former enslaved woman, became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds escape bondage. Abolitionist newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches fanned the flames of moral outrage. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that portrayed the horrors of slavery. The book became a bestseller and deeply influenced public opinion in the North, further polarizing the nation. Southern leaders condemned it as propaganda, deepening the divide. The political landscape grew increasingly volatile. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers in those territories to decide the slavery issue for themselves. This led to bloody conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Violent clashes and fraudulent elections turned Kansas into a symbol of the nation as moral and political crisis. Meanwhile, the Republican Party emerged in the mid-1850s as a new political force opposed to the expansion of slavery. Former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats united under this banner. One of the rising stars of the Republican Party was Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer and former congressman from Illinois. The national debate reached the highest legal stage in 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not U.S. citizens and had no legal standing. Furthermore, the court declared that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The decision outraged abolitionists and further emboldened the South. By the late 1850s, the nation was deeply divided. The political system was unraveling, trust was eroding, and violence had become commonplace. In 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist, led a failed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, intending to spark a slave uprising. He was captured and executed, but many Northerners hailed him as a martyr. As the 1860 presidential election approached, the stakes could not have been higher. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on a platform opposing the spread of slavery, Southern leaders viewed it as an existential threat. Within months, Southern states began seceding from the Union. In early 1861, they formed the Confederate States of America. What had begun as a hopeful experiment in liberty and self-rule was now on the brink of civil war. Decades of expansion, compromise, and conflict had come to a head. The next chapter in American history would be the most deadly and defining the fight for the soul of the nation. By 1861, the United States stood at a breaking point. Tensions between the northern and southern states had escalated for decades, rooted in fundamental disagreements over slavery, states' rights, and the balance of power between federal and local governments. The Southern economy, built on slave labor and plantation agriculture, stood in sharp contrast to the industrialized and increasingly abolitionist North. As both sides dug in deeper, compromise became impossible. The Union would soon face its greatest test, Civil War. The immediate trigger came with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Though Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery, where it already existed. His opposition to its expansion into new territories alarmed Southern leaders. They feared that Lincoln's presidency would mark the beginning of the end of slavery and with it, their way of life. In response, South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. Within months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. These 7 states formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln, who took office in March 1861, hoped to preserve the Union without bloodshed. But events moved quickly. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The fort surrendered after a brief bombardment, and the Civil War had officially begun. Following the attack, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The nation was now divided. The Union, or the North, had more people, more factories, and more railroads. The Confederacy, or the South, had superior military leadership, a strong fighting spirit, and the advantage of defending its own territory. Both sides believed the war would be short. Neither anticipated the immense cost in blood, destruction, and trauma that would follow. The first major battle of the war came in July 1861 at Bull Run, near Washington, D.C. It ended in a Confederate victory, shattering Northern hopes of a swift triumph. The war dragged on with devastating battles like Antietam, Shiloh, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Disease, poor medical care, and brutal conditions killed thousands of soldiers. Civilians endured shortages, fear, and grief. As the war progressed, Lincoln's position on slavery began to shift. Initially, the Union fought solely to preserve the Union, but abolitionists pushed for slavery to be addressed directly. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. While it did not immediately free all slaves, it changed the character of the war. Now, it was not only a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a fight to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black men would eventually serve, contributing significantly to Union victory and marking a turning point in the war as moral and political dimension. Meanwhile, the Confederacy grew increasingly desperate. Blockades crippled its economy. Food shortages led to riots. Inflation soared. In July 1863, the tide began to turn decisively at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. It was the bloodiest battle in American history, with more than 50,000 casualties. Union forces under General George Meade repelled a major Confederate invasion led by General Robert E. Lee. At the same time, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the North control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Later that year, Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address, a brief but powerful speech that redefined the meaning of the war. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and declared that government of the people, by the people, for the people, must not perish from the earth. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all Union armies. Grant launched a relentless campaign against Lee in Virginia, while General William Tecumseh Sherman led a devastating march through Georgia, destroying infrastructure, burning crops, and breaking the South's will to fight. This total war strategy, though brutal, was effective. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. Just days later, tragedy struck. On April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. At Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln died the next morning, plunging the nation into mourning. The Civil War had claimed over 620,000 lives and left vast parts of the South in ruins Slavery was abolished, but the nation faced the immense challenge of Reconstruction, rebuilding the South and integrating millions of newly freed African Americans into American society. Lincoln's death left leadership in the hands of his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who opposed many of the Republican-led Reconstruction policies. Johnson clashed repeatedly with Congress, which sought to guarantee civil rights and voting rights for former slaves and punish the Confederate leadership. Congress passed the 13th Amendment in 1865, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. A 14th Amendment followed in 1868, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, granting African American men the right to vote. These changes were revolutionary, legally transforming the status of millions of people. However, putting these ideals into practice was an uphill battle. Reconstruction governments were established in the South, supported by federal troops and backed by the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided education, legal aid, and job assistance to freedmen. For a brief period, African Americans held public office, opened schools, built churches, and began businesses. However, progress was met with fierce resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using terror and violence to suppress black political participation and intimidate reformers. Many Southern whites resented Reconstruction, viewing it as Northern occupation and interference in their affairs. The 1870s saw the gradual erosion of Reconstruction. Economic troubles in the North, including the Panic of 1873, shifted national focus away from civil rights. Northern support waned, and Democrats regained control of Southern legislatures through a mix of intimidation, fraud, and disenfranchisement tactics. The final blow came with the Compromise of 1877, which ended the disputed presidential election of 1876. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. This effectively ended Reconstruction. In the absence of federal enforcement, Jim Crow laws quickly spread throughout the South, codifying racial segregation and suppressing black voting rights. Though slavery had ended, a new system of oppression emerged that would persist for nearly a century. Despite the setbacks, the Civil War and Reconstruction had forever altered the United States. The Union had been preserved. Slavery was abolished. The Constitution had been expanded to include new protections for liberty and equality, but the promise of Reconstruction remained incomplete. Racial injustice, economic inequality, and political divisions would continue to shape the American story. As the 19th century continued, the country turned its focus westward, fueled by a belief in manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to expand from coast to coast. Railroads, industry, immigration, and innovation would soon reshape the nation. But the wounds of the Civil War and the unfinished work of Reconstruction would linger for generations to come. Following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the United States entered an era of remarkable economic growth and transformation. This period, often called the Gilded Age, was marked by rapid industrialization, massive urban expansion, technological innovation, the rise of tycoons and monopolies, and profound social and political shifts. Beneath the glittering surface of prosperity, however, lay widespread corruption, exploitation of labor, and growing inequality. The name Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain, suggested a golden surface that hid deeper problems beneath. One of the most significant forces shaping this era was industrialization. After the Civil War, the U.S. economy shifted from primarily agrarian to heavily industrial. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, linking cities, ports, and farmlands. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected the East Coast to the West Coast, transforming transportation, commerce, and migration. Steel, oil, and coal industries boomed. The Bessemer process made steel production cheaper and more efficient, fueling the rise of skyscrapers and massive bridges. The United States became the world's leading producer of manufactured goods by the late 19th century. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, dominated the steel industry and amassed a fortune by streamlining production and slashing costs. He famously believed in the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich had a duty to give back to society. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into one of the most powerful and controversial monopolies in history. By ruthlessly eliminating competition, cutting deals with railroads, and vertically integrating his operations, Rockefeller controlled nearly 90% of U.S. oil refining at his peak. J.P. Morgan, the powerful banker, financed railroads, consolidated companies, and stabilized markets during crisis, effectively becoming a central figure in American capitalism. These industrialists, often called captains of industry by admirers and robber barons by critics, embodied the new American economy. While they created jobs and pushed technological progress, they also manipulated markets, underpaid workers, crushed labor unions, and influenced politics to protect their interests. Labor conditions in factories, mines, and railroads were often brutal. Workers endured long hours, low pay, unsafe environments, and little job security. Many lived in overcrowded tenements in growing urban slums. Child labor was widespread. As a response, workers began organizing. The Knights of Labor, formed in 1869, was one of the first major labor organizations and aimed to unite all workers, regardless of skill level, gender, or race. Later, the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers, focused on skilled workers and pushed for higher wages and better conditions through collective bargaining. Tensions between labor and management often erupted into violence. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 in Chicago began as a peaceful protest but ended with a bomb explosion and deaths, leading to widespread anti-union sentiment. The Homestead Strike in 1892 at Carnegie Steel turned deadly when private guards and striking workers clashed. The Pullman Strike of 1894 disrupted rail traffic nationwide until federal troops intervened, siding with business owners. These events highlighted the growing pains of industrial America and the fierce resistance to labor reform. While factories and cities grew, so did immigration. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, Jews, Russians, Greeks, and others sought escape from poverty, persecution, and lack of opportunity in their homelands. Many settled in industrial cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, taking jobs in steel mills, garment factories, and construction. Immigrants brought new languages, cultures, religions, and traditions, enriching American society, but also provoking fear and resentment from native-born citizens. This surge in immigration led to the rise of nativism, a belief that America should remain predominantly Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. Anti-immigrant groups lobbied for restrictions. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major federal law to ban immigration based on nationality, and it set a precedent for future restrictions. Xenophobia and racism flourished in some quarters, even as immigrants built the very cities and industries powering the economy. American cities expanded rapidly. In 1860, only 1 in 6 Americans lived in cities. By 1900, nearly 40% of Americans were urban dwellers. Cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston swelled with new arrivals. Skyscrapers reached skyward, powered by steel frames and elevators. Streetcars and electric lights transformed city life. But with growth came serious problems. Overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, polluted water, and crime. Reformers like Jacob Riis, in his book How the Other Half Lives, exposed the squalid conditions of tenement life and spurred calls for urban reform. This era also saw the emergence of powerful political machines in cities' organizations that provided services and favors in exchange for votes. The most notorious was Tammany Hall in New York City, led by Boss Tweed. These machines helped immigrants navigate the complex urban landscape, but were also rife with corruption, embezzlement, and nepotism. Reformers tried to dismantle these systems and implement civil service reforms to reduce patronage. Amid this backdrop of economic upheaval and urban growth, a new political movement emerged: populism. Farmers in the South and Midwest, feeling crushed by debt, high railroad rates, and falling crop prices, began organizing into cooperatives and political groups. The Grange movement, followed by the Farmers' Alliances, culminated in the formation of the Populist Party in 1891. The Populists called for government ownership of railroads, direct election of senators, income tax reforms, and the use of silver to inflate currency and ease debts. In the 1896 presidential election, the Populists backed William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat who delivered his famous Cross of Gold speech advocating for bimetallism. However, William McKinley, a Republican supported by industrialists and bankers, won the presidency. This defeat signaled the decline of the populist movement, but marked the beginning of political realignment that would shape the next century. The United States was not only transforming internally, it was also beginning to assert itself on the global stage. This period marked the start of American imperialism. With its industrial might, the country sought new markets and resources abroad. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a turning point, triggered by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, and fueled by sensationalist yellow journalism. The war led to a swift U.S. victory over Spain. As a result, the U.S. gained control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and exerted influence over Cuba. This expansion signaled America's arrival as a global power. The acquisition of the Philippines, however, led to a brutal war of resistance. Filipino nationalists, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, fought against U.S. rule, resulting in a bloody conflict that lasted several years and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The war sparked debate in the U.S. over the morality of imperialism and America's role in the world. The annexation of Hawaii in 1898 was another step in U.S. expansion. American business interests had long dominated the islands, and when Queen Liliuokalani sought to reclaim native sovereignty, a group of American planters and U.S. Marines overthrew her. Hawaii's strategic location in the Pacific made it valuable for military and commercial purposes. At home, progressive voices were beginning to rise in response to the inequities of the Gilded Age. Reformers, journalists, and activists pushed for changes in labor laws, child welfare, housing, and political accountability. Muckrakers like Ida Tarbell, who exposed Standard Oil's monopolistic practices, and Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle revealed horrific conditions in meatpacking plants, helped galvanize public opinion. Their work laid the foundation for the upcoming progressive era, a time when government would begin to play a more active role in regulating the economy and addressing social issues. As the 20th century dawned, the United States stood transformed. It had evolved from a fractured post-Civil War nation into a unified industrial powerhouse. Its cities bustled with energy, its factories hummed with productivity, and its navy patrolled oceans far from American shores. But the Gilded Age had left unresolved tensions between rich and poor, labor and capital, immigrants and nativists that would continue to shape the American experience. The seeds of reform had been planted, and the coming years would see a struggle to balance the promises of progress with the demands of justice and democracy. As the 1920s drew to a close, the United States stood at the height of global power and optimism. The post-World War I economy had boomed, cities had grown, industries had flourished, and new technologies had reshaped American life. However, beneath this surface of prosperity lay deep economic imbalances, rising inequality, speculative bubbles in the stock market, and unchecked banking practices. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed, and the country plunged into the worst economic downturn in its history, the Great Depression. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, panic spread quickly. Millions of Americans watched their savings vanish overnight. Banks failed en masse, businesses closed their doors, and the unemployment rate soared to unprecedented levels. By 1933, over 25% of the workforce was unemployed. People stood in bread lines, lived in shanty towns derisively called Hoovervilles, and faced a future that seemed increasingly hopeless. The agricultural sector was devastated as well, especially in the Great Plains, where a combination of drought and poor farming practices led to the Dust Bowl massive dust storms that destroyed farmland and displaced thousands of families, many of whom fled west to California in search of work and survival. President Herbert Hoover, who was in office at the onset of the crisis, maintained a belief in limited government intervention. He urged volunteerism and private charity as solutions, but these measures were woefully inadequate in the face of such massive economic collapse. The public's frustration with his perceived inaction paved the way for a dramatic political shift in the 1932 election, when Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide. FDR entered office with a promise of a New Deal for the American people, a bold series of federal programs, reforms, and public works, initiatives aimed at restoring confidence, creating jobs, and reforming the economic system to prevent future crises. The New Deal is not a single piece of legislation, but rather a collection of efforts rolled out in phases. During his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt pushed through sweeping legislation, including the Emergency Banking Act, which stabilized the banking system, and the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed bank deposits. Roosevelt's fireside chats radio, broadcasts where he spoke directly to the American people, helped reassure the public and reframe the relationship between citizens and their government. Agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and the Works Progress Administration created millions of jobs, building roads, schools, bridges, and parks. Artists, writers, and musicians were also employed to contribute to the cultural enrichment of society. The New Deal also introduced critical reforms to the financial sector. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses, while the Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled, transforming the federal government's role in ensuring social welfare. However, the New Deal faced opposition. Conservatives argued it expanded federal power too much and stifled business. The Supreme Court initially struck down several New Deal programs as unconstitutional. In response, Roosevelt proposed a controversial court-packing plan that would have allowed him to appoint additional justices more favorable to his policies. Though the plan failed, the court eventually began to uphold New Deal laws, and Roosevelt's influence reshaped the judiciary for a generation. Despite these reforms, the Depression did not fully end with the New Deal. Unemployment remained high through the 1930s, and economic growth was slow. It would take another global crisis, World War II, to pull the United States fully out of economic despair. In Europe and Asia, during the late 1930s, fascist regimes began expanding aggressively. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles and began annexing territory. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia, while militaristic Japan expanded into China and Southeast Asia. As totalitarian powers rose, the U.S. initially maintained a policy of isolationism, passing neutrality acts to avoid entanglement in another foreign war. But events overseas soon made isolationism increasingly untenable. The outbreak of World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. The U.S. remained officially neutral, but began aiding the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other nations with vital war materials. Meanwhile, tensions with Japan escalated in the Pacific due to Japanese expansion and U.S. embargoes on critical supplies like oil. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The U.S. was now fully engaged in World War II. Mobilization was swift and massive. Factories across the country were converted to produce tanks, airplanes, and ammunition. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, while African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans also contributed significantly, despite facing discrimination. The economy roared back to life with full employment and increased industrial output. The government issued war bonds and rationed materials to support the war effort. On the home front, however, not all policies were just. In a moment of fear and prejudice, the U.S. government ordered the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were citizens, forcing them into remote camps under suspicion of disloyalty. This action, later widely condemned, highlighted the tension between civil liberties and national security during times of crisis. The war in Europe turned in the Allies' favor by 1943. After brutal fighting in North Africa and Italy, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, storming the beaches of Normandy, France. This massive operation opened a Western front against Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pushed from the east after breaking the Nazi siege of Stalingrad and reclaiming vast territories. By April 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Berlin. Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered on May 8th, known as VE Day. The war in the Pacific, however, raged on. Fierce battles were fought on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese military showed little sign of surrendering, even as their losses mounted and American bombers destroyed major cities. Facing the prospect of a prolonged and bloody invasion of Japan, President Harry S. Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, made a fateful decision. In August 1945, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The unprecedented destruction and loss of life shocked the world. Japan surrendered shortly after, on August 15, 1945, marking VJ Day and the end of World War II. The war had transformed the United States. Over 400,000 Americans lost their lives, but the country emerged stronger than ever economically, militarily, and politically. The U.S. had become a superpower and a central architect of the post-war world. Institutions like the United Nations were established to prevent future global conflict, and the foundations were laid for a new global order dominated by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. World War II had also reshaped American society. Women and minorities had taken on new roles. The federal government had expanded in size and scope, and the economy had reached new heights. But it also exposed deep contradictions, racism, inequality, and the limits of liberty that would come to the forefront in the decades ahead. As the U.S. moved into the second half of the 20th century, it would face new challenges in a rapidly changing world. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a turning point, not just for the world, but especially for the United States. Having emerged as a global superpower, the U.S. was no longer an isolated giant, it was now a leader of the free world. The war had pulled the country out of the Great Depression, reshaped industries, empowered a generation of veterans, and set the stage for new domestic and international challenges. While soldiers returned home to celebration and prosperity, new struggles loomed. A Cold War abroad and a civil rights movement at home. Domestically, the U.S. saw tremendous economic growth in the late 1940s and 1950s. Known as the post-war boom, this era witnessed the rapid expansion of the American middle class. Wartime industries converted to civilian production. Veterans used GI Bill benefits to attend college and buy homes. And suburban neighborhoods like Levittown sprang up seemingly overnight. Baby boomers were born by the millions, and car culture became a way of life. Televisions entered homes, and consumerism defined the American dream. President Harry Truman, who took office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in 1945, faced the enormous task of transitioning the nation from wartime to peacetime. Internationally, he oversaw the end of the war in the Pacific by making the controversial decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Domestically, he promoted civil rights, desegregated the military in 1948, and supported New Deal-style policies under what he called the Fair Deal. Meanwhile, the Cold War began to take shape. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, quickly turned into its chief rival. The world was now divided between two ideologies: capitalist democracy and communist authoritarianism. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine declared the U.S. would aid countries resisting communism, leading to U.S. involvement in Greece, Turkey, and beyond. The Marshall Plan provided billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe, in part to prevent communist influence from taking root. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, a military alliance aimed at deterring Soviet aggression. Domestically, the Cold War fueled fear and suspicion. The House Un-American Activities Committee and Senator Joseph McCarthy launched aggressive campaigns to root out alleged communists in government, Hollywood, and academia. This Red Scare led to blacklists, careers destroyed, and a national atmosphere of paranoia. Meanwhile, in 1950, the Korean War broke out when North Korea invaded South Korea. The U.S., under the United Nations banner, intervened to stop the spread of communism. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, but no peace treaty setting the stage for future tensions. In the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II hero, became president. His calm leadership helped stabilize the country during the Cold War. Eisenhower invested heavily in infrastructure, including the creation of the interstate highway system, which revolutionized travel and commerce. Despite being a Republican, he maintained many New Deal programs and warned against the growing military-industrial complex in his farewell address. While the nation prospered economically, deep social issues remained unresolved. Chief among them was racial segregation. African Americans had fought in both world wars and contributed to the economy, but they still faced systemic discrimination in housing, education, employment, and public life, especially in the segregated South. This inequality gave rise to the modern civil rights movement. The movement took a defining turn in 1954 with the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. While it was a major legal victory, implementation was slow and met with fierce resistance in many states. In 1955, a seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a segregated bus. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a year-long protest led by a young pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott ended in a Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation on public buses unconstitutional. King's leadership catapulted him into the national spotlight and laid the groundwork for future activism based on nonviolent protest. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement gained momentum. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and legal challenges confronted injustice across the country. In 1963, the nation watched as King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a massive peaceful demonstration attended by over 250,000 people. He called for racial equality, justice, and an end to segregation. But progress came at a high cost. Civil rights activists were beaten, arrested, and even killed. In 1963, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi. That same year, 4 young black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Despite this violence, the movement persisted and made major legislative gains. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who took office after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. This landmark legislation outlawed discrimination in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, eliminating literacy tests and other barriers that had disenfranchised black voters for decades. Johnson, who declared a war on poverty, also expanded social programs through his Great Society initiative. This included Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Head Start, and major funding for education and housing. These reforms significantly reduced poverty and improved access to health care and education for millions of Americans. But the nation was deeply divided. While legal segregation was being dismantled, de facto segregation and racial inequality persisted. Urban unrest and police brutality led to riots in cities like Los Angeles, Newark, and Detroit. The civil rights movement itself began to fragment. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Black Panther Party began advocating more militant approaches, frustrated with the slow pace of change and ongoing injustice. In foreign policy, the Vietnam War loomed large. The U.S. had gradually increased its involvement in Vietnam since the 1950s to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. By the mid-1960s, thousands of American troops were being sent to fight a war that would become increasingly unpopular. Protest movements against the war grew rapidly, especially among students, clergy, and civil rights leaders. Many questioned why the U.S. was fighting for freedom abroad while denying basic rights to its own citizens at home. In April 1968, tragedy struck again when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. His death triggered riots in over 100 American cities and left the nation in mourning. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, who had become a strong advocate for civil rights and a presidential candidate, was also assassinated. By the end of the 1960s, the optimism of the post-war years had given way to a period of upheaval. The civil rights movement had achieved significant victories, but the struggle for racial equality, economic justice, and peace was far from over. The United States had changed dramatically in just 2 decades, becoming more powerful, more diverse, and more conflicted. As the nation approached the 1970s, it stood at a crossroads facing the consequences of war, political division, and a society still striving to fulfill its founding promise of liberty and justice for all. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States, marking a sharp shift in American politics. A former Hollywood actor and 2-term governor of California, Reagan came into office at a time of economic recession, Cold War tensions, and shaken national confidence after Vietnam, Watergate, and the Iran hostage crisis. Reagan promised a revival of American strength, optimism, and conservative values. His presidency would define an era of political transformation, economic change, and renewed global engagement. Reagan's economic policies, dubbed Reaganomics, focused on supply-side theory, reducing taxes on businesses and the wealthy to stimulate investment and economic growth. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 significantly cut income taxes. Reagan also aimed to reduce government spending on social programs while increasing the defense budget. His administration pursued widespread deregulation of industries such as banking, energy, and telecommunications. The U.S. economy, after a brief downturn, rebounded in the mid-1980s with strong GDP growth, falling inflation, and rising consumer confidence. However, critics pointed to the growing federal deficit, an expanding gap between rich and poor, and underinvestment in social welfare programs. On the international stage, Reagan took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, which he famously labeled the evil empire. He launched a massive military buildup, including the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, aimed at neutralizing Soviet missiles. His confrontational rhetoric and military assertiveness worried some but rallied Cold War hawks. Yet, Reagan was also pragmatic. In his second term, he found common ground with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who had introduced major reforms in the USSR. Their series of summit meetings led to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which eliminated a class of nuclear weapons. These moves helped ease tensions and signaled the beginning of the end of the Cold War. At home, Reagan survived an assassination attempt just 2 months into his presidency. He remained highly popular with much of the public, admired for his communication skills, dubbed the Great Communicator. His administration, however, faced significant scandals. The most damaging was the Iran-Contra affair, in which senior officials secretly sold arms to Iran and funneled the proceeds to anti-communist rebels. In Nicaragua, violating both U.S. law and stated policy. While Reagan claimed ignorance, the scandal raised serious constitutional questions about executive authority and covert operations. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, was elected president. Bush, a veteran of World War II and former CII director, campaigned on continuing Reagan's policies. His presidency was marked by historic global shifts. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, symbolizing the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, ending the Cold War. The U.S. emerged as the world's sole superpower. Bush also faced new military challenges. When Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, Bush led an international coalition to expel Iraqi forces. Operation Desert Storm, launched in January 1991, was a swift and decisive victory. The Gulf War demonstrated U.S. military dominance and reasserted America's leadership on the world stage. Domestically, however, Bush struggled. A recession in the early 1990s and his reversal on a no new taxes pledge hurt his credibility. In 1992, he was defeated by Democrat Bill Clinton, the youthful governor of Arkansas. Bill Clinton, elected at age 46, promised to modernize the Democratic Party and focus on economic growth. His administration benefited from a booming economy driven by technological innovation, especially the rapid rise of the internet and information technology sectors. Unemployment fell, inflation remained low, and the U.S. federal budget eventually reached a surplus by the end of the 1990s, the first in decades. Clinton pursued centrist policies, combining free market economics with investments in education and health care. He championed welfare reform in 1996, signing a bill that imposed work requirements and time limits on federal assistance. Clinton also oversaw major international developments. He expanded NATO to include former Eastern Bloc countries, promoted global trade through agreements like NIFTA, and intervened militarily in the Balkans to stop ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. He promoted peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians and worked to improve relations with China. His foreign policy emphasized diplomacy, global engagement, and economic globalization. Yet Clinton's presidency was also marred by controversy. Allegations of sexual misconduct and questions about financial dealings dogged his administration. The most serious scandal involved his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. After initially denying the relationship, Clinton admitted to it under oath, prompting accusations of perjury. In 1998, the House of Representatives impeached Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. However, the Senate acquitted him, and he remained in office. Despite the scandal, Clinton left office in 2001 with high approval ratings, and the U.S. enjoying a period of peace and prosperity. As the 21st century approached, America was a global superpower at the height of its influence. The Cold War had ended, and the U.S. economy was the largest and most dynamic in the world. The technology boom created new industries, wealth, and cultural change. Personal computers, mobile phones, and the internet were becoming household staples. Yet, challenges loomed. The dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s, raising fears of economic slowdown. Global terrorism was rising, with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1998 U.S. Embassy attacks in Africa serving as ominous warnings. In the presidential election of 2000, Republican George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush, ran against Democratic Vice President Al Gore. The election was one of the most contested in U.S. history. After a close vote in Florida and a controversial recount, the Supreme Court intervened in Bush v. Gore, effectively handing the presidency to George W. Bush. The decision was highly divisive, and Bush entered office amid questions about the legitimacy of the outcome. Bush focused initially on domestic issues tax cuts, education reform through the No Child Left Behind Act, and expanding Medicare. However, the direction of his presidency and American history would change dramatically just months into his term. On September 11, 2001, terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Another hit the Pentagon. The 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people died in the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. The 9/11 attacks marked a turning point. The sense of national unity, grief, and determination led to a profound shift in American foreign and domestic policy. President Bush declared a war on terror, vowing to root out terrorism worldwide. Just weeks after the attacks, the U.S. launched military operations in Afghanistan, targeting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that sheltered them. The invasion was swift, and Taliban forces were ousted from power by the end of the year. However, the conflict would evolve into a long and complicated war lasting 2 decades. Back home, the federal government created the Department of Homeland Security and passed the USA Patriot Act to increase surveillance and counterterrorism efforts. While many supported these measures as necessary for national security, others warned they threatened civil liberties. The nation had entered a new era, one defined by global terrorism, the rise of digital technology, and questions about the balance between freedom and security. By the end of 2001, the United States stood at a crossroads. The optimism and prosperity of the 1990s had been shaken by recession and terror. The country was preparing for prolonged military conflict abroad, while grappling with deep questions about its role in the world and the principles at the heart of its democracy. As the new millennium dawned, the United States stood as the world's lone superpower, having emerged victorious from the Cold War and enjoying a booming economy during the 1990s. The year 2000 was marked by a contentious presidential election between Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Al Gore. The outcome was decided not by the popular vote Gore won that, but by the Supreme Court, which halted a Florida recount and effectively handed the presidency to Bush. The ruling, Bush v. Gore, was one of the most controversial in American judicial history, casting a long shadow over Bush's early presidency and deepening the nation's political divide. Barely 9 months into George W. Bush's presidency, the world changed forever. On September 11, 2001, 4 commercial airliners were hijacked by 19 terrorists affiliated with the Islamist extremist group Al-Qaeda. 2 planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, a third into the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., and the 4th, thanks to the heroism of passengers, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. The images of collapsing skyscrapers, smoke-filled skies, and terrified citizens became seared into the national consciousness. The U.S. response was swift. President Bush declared a global war on terror. Within weeks, American forces invaded Afghanistan, targeting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that harbored them. Although initial military objectives were quickly achieved, the war became America's longest conflict, stretching on for 2 decades. In 2003, the Bush administration expanded the war on terror by invading Iraq, citing the threat of weapons of mass destruction and alleged links between Saddam Hussein and terrorist networks. No WMDs were found, and the justification for war was widely criticized at home and abroad. The invasion led to years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and regional instability. The human cost American soldiers, Iraqi civilians, and displaced families was profound. Back home, the Department of Homeland Security was created, and laws such as the U.S. Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers. Airports introduced strict security screenings, and Muslim Americans often faced increased scrutiny and discrimination. The post-9/11 era redefined security, civil liberties, and America's role in the world. In 2005, the nation watched in horror as Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and surrounding Gulf Coast regions. The storm surge breached levees, flooding 80% of the city and killing over 1,800 people. The federal government's slow and disorganized response revealed deep inequalities and sparked widespread outrage. Images of stranded families on rooftops, people trapped in the Superdome, and a city drowning in chaos exposed the limits of American preparedness and compassion. Despite these crises, the 2000s also saw rapid technological change. Apple introduced the iPod in 2001 and the iPhone in 2007, ushering in the smartphone era. Facebook launched in 2004, followed by YouTube in 2005 and Twitter in 2006, revolutionizing how Americans communicated, consumed media, and formed communities. Silicon Valley became the engine of innovation, and the rise of social media would dramatically influence culture, politics, and even democracy itself. The 2008 financial crisis was another turning point. Sparked by risky lending, mortgage defaults, and the collapse of major financial institutions like Lehman Brothers, the crisis sent global markets into freefall. The U.S. entered the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Millions lost their homes, savings, and jobs. In response, Congress passed massive bailouts and stimulus packages to stabilize the economy. Anger over the perceived favoritism toward banks led to the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, which protested economic inequality, and corporate power with the slogan, "We are the 99%. Amid this backdrop, the 2008 presidential election marked a historic moment. Democrat Barack Obama, a junior senator from Illinois, was elected the first African-American president of the United States. His campaign of hope and change energized millions, especially young voters and minorities. Obama inherited a nation in crisis, but sought to bring stability. His administration passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to stimulate the economy and the Affordable Care Act in 2010 to expand healthcare coverage to millions. Obama's presidency also saw the end of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the legalization of same-sex marriage, and the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 by U.S. Navy SEALs in Pakistan. Yet his tenure was not without challenges. Partisan gridlock intensified, particularly after Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 2010. The Tea Party movement emerged, pushing a more radical conservative agenda and accusing Obama of overreach. Race relations came under intense scrutiny during Obama's presidency. Incidents such as the shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and numerous other police-involved deaths of Black Americans sparked national protests and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. These events laid bare ongoing racial tensions and institutional inequalities in policing and criminal justice. In 2016, the nation once again faced a polarizing election. Republican Donald Trump, a billionaire businessman and TV personality, defeated Democrat Hillary Clinton in a surprise victory. Trump's campaign, marked by populist rhetoric, anti-immigrant policies, and sharp criticism of the political establishment, resonated with many Americans who felt left behind by globalization and cultural change. However, it also exposed deep divisions: urban versus rural, progressive versus traditional, globalist versus nationalist. Trump's presidency defied norms and sparked constant controversy. He withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, enacted travel bans targeting Muslim-majority countries, pursued strict immigration policies, including family separations at the southern border, and appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, shifting the court's ideological balance. His use of Twitter to bypass traditional media and directly speak to supporters was unprecedented. While his base remained loyal, critics accused him of eroding democratic norms, spreading misinformation, and inflaming racial tensions. In 2020, the world was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus, first identified in China in late 2019, rapidly spread across the globe. By March 2020, the United States entered lockdowns as hospitals filled and deaths surged. The economy tanked, unemployment soared, and daily life changed drastically. Mask mandates, remote work, school closures, and strained healthcare systems became the new normal. The federal response, led by the Trump administration, was widely criticized as inconsistent and politicized. Misinformation and distrust in science fueled vaccine hesitancy and conspiracies. As the pandemic raged, the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin ignited global protests. Millions marched under the banner of Black Lives Matter, demanding justice and an end to systemic racism. Statues were toppled, cities erupted in both peaceful demonstrations and violent clashes, and a long overdue national conversation about race, policing, and privilege unfolded. The 2020 presidential election was one of the most contentious in history. Amid the pandemic, mail-in voting surged. Democrat Joe Biden ran on a message of unity, public health, and restoring norms. Despite winning by over 7 million votes, Trump refused to concede, claiming the election was stolen. His false claims culminated in the January 6, 2021, Capitol insurrection, when supporters stormed Congress in an attempt to overturn the results. The attack shocked the world and led to Trump's second impeachment. He was acquitted both times. As the world entered the 2020s, the United States found itself at a critical crossroads. The global COVID-19 pandemic, which emerged in late 2019 and escalated rapidly in early 2020, disrupted nearly every aspect of American life. The virus infected millions and claimed over 1 million American lives. The economy experienced one of its most abrupt contractions in modern history. Unemployment soared and supply chains buckled. Cities once vibrant fell silent under lockdowns, and hospitals overflowed with patients. The government launched massive relief programs, including stimulus checks and expanded unemployment benefits, in an attempt to stabilize the economy and protect vulnerable populations. In the midst of the pandemic, another wave of unrest surged across the country after the killing of George Floyd, a black man, by a white police officer in Minneapolis in May 2020. The incident, captured on video and widely circulated on social media, triggered nationwide protests under the banner of the Black Lives Matter movement. Millions took to the streets in cities across the United States and beyond, demanding justice, police reform, and racial equality. While the protests were largely peaceful, some instances of violence and looting fueled political controversy and further polarized public discourse. The 2020 presidential election unfolded under this backdrop of uncertainty, fear, and division. It saw a record number of mail-in ballots due to pandemic safety concerns and the highest voter turnout in over a century. Former Vice President Joe Biden, running on a platform of national healing and pandemic response, defeated incumbent President Donald Trump. Trump, however, disputed the results, claiming widespread election fraud without substantive evidence. This culminated in the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol, where a violent mob stormed the seat of American democracy in an attempt to stop the certification of the electoral vote. The event shocked the nation and the world, leading to the second impeachment of Donald Trump and heightened concerns about the fragility of American democratic institutions. Joe Biden took office in January 2021 amid these intense divisions. His administration immediately prioritized pandemic response, rolling out vaccines rapidly across the country. By mid-2021, much of the country had access to COVID-19 vaccines, although vaccine hesitancy and misinformation campaigns often amplified through social media hindered nationwide uptake. The Biden administration also passed a sweeping infrastructure bill, sought to address climate change through executive orders and legislation, and pushed for student debt relief and expanded health care. However, with a narrowly divided Congress, many of his broader legislative ambitions faced gridlock. Meanwhile, the culture wars in the United States deepened. Topics such as gender identity, school curricula, gun rights, and abortion became flashpoints in American society. In June 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, ending nearly 50 years of federal protection for abortion rights. The decision was met with celebration in some conservative circles and deep anguish among pro-choice advocates. It also reignited political activism at the state level, as individual states moved swiftly to either ban or protect abortion rights. Technological advancement continued to reshape American life in unprecedented ways. Social media platforms like TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram became the primary battlegrounds for public opinion, misinformation, and cultural debate. Billionaire Elon Musk acquired Twitter in 2022, stirring debate around free speech, platform moderation, and digital responsibility. Artificial intelligence, especially models like ChatGPT, gained prominence, raising hopes of increased productivity, but also concerns about job automation, data privacy, and intellectual property. In global affairs, the United States found itself reasserting its traditional alliances. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the U.S. responded with military aid to Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. This marked a return to Cold War-era geopolitical tension, with NATO cohesion becoming a renewed priority. Meanwhile, relations with China continued to evolve with a mix of economic competition and strategic rivalry, especially concerning Taiwan, global supply chains, and technological dominance. Back home, the U.S. faced growing challenges around inflation, housing affordability, and immigration. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates in an attempt to combat inflation, which had surged due to pandemic-related supply disruptions, labor shortages, and geopolitical instability. The housing market became increasingly inaccessible for younger Americans, leading to a national debate on affordability, zoning laws, and corporate ownership of residential properties. At the southern border, immigration surged, driven by instability in Central and South America. Debates raged over asylum policies, border security, and the future of undocumented migrants. By 2023, the American political landscape remained polarized. The Republican Party saw internal divides between traditional conservatives and the populist wing still aligned with Donald Trump, who hinted at and eventually confirmed another run for presidency in 2024. Democrats grappled with generational divides, progressive versus centrist policy battles, and mounting pressure from climate activists, labor unions, and civil rights organizations. Despite the turmoil, the United States also witnessed a cultural renaissance. American film, music, and sports remained globally influential. The 2023 Academy Awards saw increased recognition for diverse voices, and athletes continued using their platforms for social advocacy. Technology startups flourished, especially in green energy, biotech, and fintech. The nation also began reckoning with its historical narrative through renewed interest in indigenous history, reparations discussions, and inclusive education initiatives. As 2024 approached, the United States remained a country both admired and questioned. Its promise of liberty, innovation, and resilience persisted, even as internal divisions and external challenges tested its endurance. While the future remained uncertain, what was clear was the nation's continued relevance in shaping the global narrative.